Hey everyone, welcome to Strange Stories, where we explore near-death experiences and supernatural stories from people who've had a glimpse of the other side. If you enjoy our content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Without further ado, let's get to the story of the day. Story number 1. Okay. To the best of my abilities, here is my experience, the events that led up to it, as well as my thoughts and feelings in the weeks that followed. On May 25, 2000, I was involved in a serious vehicle accident. I was traveling on an unfamiliar road when I took a sharp turn at high speed. My automobile collided with a culvert. I'm still not sure what that is, but it was noted on my crash report. I split a telephone pole in two after the culvert, went 8 feet airborne, hit a steel billboard support post, and came to rest upside down against a tree. The first state trooper on the site told my husband that when he saw the truck, he knew they were going to scrape me from the inside. The car was totaled and rated on 5 on a 1 to 5 severity rating. The destruction was unfathomable, and I have 2 photos that remind me every day how fortunate I am to have survived. When he saw the car, my husband almost puked. I was accused of not wearing my seatbelt. I was still locked inside the vehicle as I began to regain consciousness. I could hear machines and conversations all around me, but all I could see were trees and faces. My seat had fallen, and I found myself lying exactly flat beneath the steering wheel, which is most likely what saved my life. I have no recollection of the accident. I recall driving before the crash, and then waking up to the jaws of life ripping my car apart to pull me out. I believe I must have anticipated the impact, and this is most likely when the NDE occurred. It's crucial to note that I was never pronounced clinically dead, but the prospect of death was very strong and must have triggered the experience. I must have known without a doubt that I was doomed, even though I don't recall ever consciously thinking this. I suppose if you see yourself racing toward a telephone pole at breakneck speed, you'd assume you're about to die. Yet I can't remember consciously seeing it coming. That is most likely a blessing in disguise. Following the accident, I regarded all telephone poles as crosses and still stare at them, entranced by how much they do to resemble a cross at the very top. I recall experiencing the most agonizing pain or pleasure conceivable. It was severe, all-consuming torment that culminated in the most profound ecstasy, euphoria beyond description, yet I knew I had felt Christ. I sensed the crucifixion and knew without a doubt that I had experienced exactly what Jesus experienced on the cross. I was entirely one with him. I felt everything about Jesus. There was a period of severe anguish and suffering, followed by a period of release. Then there was absolute joy. I never saw any light at any time. I was in a nothingness, a blackness or vacuum, and I was alone, in the sense that I couldn't see anyone else, but I didn't feel alone since I felt one with everything and everyone. Without a doubt, I realized that everyone and everything in the universe is interconnected, that we are all interconnected. I realized I was everlasting, to learn that eternity is true and has never been a falsehood or fiction. And I recall thinking, oh my God, I'm dead. I recall thinking it was the most beautiful thing that could have ever happened to me, the happiest day of my entire existence, that there was nothing sad about it as I had always expected. The only emotions I felt were pure joy, happiness, and bliss at discovering my immortality. It wasn't an idea or a sensation. It was a knowledge. And I remember thinking how excited I was to inform my husband that we would be together for the rest of our lives. And I recall repeatedly thanking God that eternity exists. When I regained consciousness while still imprisoned in the truck, the first thing I'm informed I said to the state policeman, which I do not recall, was, "What does ecstasy feel like?" I recall taking a handful of pictures of my kids from what was left of the console and starting to push out of the car with my legs. The paramedics instructed me to remain still, but I did not. I was crying for my children and spouse, and I remember thinking to myself, yeah, right. I'm not staying in here 1 second longer. I increased my efforts. They drew me out by putting their hands under my arms. The nurses in the emergency room were complimenting me on my jewelry. I was wearing bracelets with shrubs and angels that stated love and heaven. I had purchased them the morning of the crash. In the ER, I questioned the doctor. What is a stigmata? He explained that it's someone who bears Christ's wounds. My injuries were comparable but not identical to Christ's wounds. Slashes across my hairline, cuts on the bottoms of both feet, and both hands were wounded. What I was certain of was that I had truly felt Christ. It reminded me of the CAT scan machine's tomb. I kept telling my pals that I was going to have a baby. This baby was born on May 1st of this year. When I arrived at the hospital, the first thing I did was grab the Bible. I began writing down every piece about unconditional love and the second coming that I came across. I talked about the second coming all the time and honestly believed it could arrive at any time. When I first arrived at the hospital, I thought I'd been raptured and was in some type of waiting room. I felt entirely in tune with nature, animals, and children for the first 2 weeks after the event. During my first 2 days in the hospital, I had a mind connection with my nurses. When they gave me my discharge papers and left the room, I was quite distraught about having to go. I was scared about returning to the real world. Within 5 minutes of this tremendous fear, the nurse returned to my room and informed me I could remain another night if I wanted. I told no one that I didn't want to leave. "Do you remember being here yet?" one of the nurses asked. "I've never been here before," I exclaimed. "You'll remember more as time goes on," she stated, and I still have no idea what she meant. My husband and I had some of our worst disagreements in the weeks following this all, and it took something away from me. He would not let me stay where I wanted to be indefinitely. He wouldn't let me hold on to that amazing sense of togetherness, peace, pleasure, and love that I crave right now. For the first few weeks, I still felt one with Jesus. A family member said he could see the Spirit in my eyes, which were nearly shining. I felt what I thought was the Holy Spirit indwelling me. When my stepdaughter cut her finger, I kissed it to stop the blood. She thought I literally stopped the bleeding with my kiss. I'm not saying that my experience shows beyond a shadow of doubt that there is an afterlife, but it's all the proof I'll ever need. Most significantly, I now have conclusive proof that Jesus and the Holy Spirit exist within every one of us. Story number 2. On January 18, 2001, I began experiencing severe stomach pain. I sent an ambulance to my apartment, and by the time it arrived, my right side had become quite rigid. When I arrived at the hospital, I was diagnosed with severe peritonitis caused by a ruptured appendix. My situation was considered very serious by the emergency department doctor, who ordered that I be prepared for surgery as soon as possible. Although I was semi-drunk from the pain, I could hear what the doctor was saying, and because of my training as medical and biochemical interpreter, I knew I was in grave danger. The operations were ready, and I was in the operating room awaiting the arrival of the surgeon who would do the procedure. I realized I hadn't uttered the prayers I typically say in the morning, so I began to repeat them silently to myself while I waited. As the end approached, I seemed to enter a different condition and began to wonder if I was ready to die and leave everything I'd ever known behind. Is it time for me to leave my job? Is it time for me to give up my passion for music? I answered each question positively. The final question was, am I willing to leave my 2 children? I replied yes, and immediately felt lighter and pain-free, yet I could still feel my body, and my side was hard. I was then told, not in words, but in a way that I felt deep within me, that it was not my time to die, but that when it came, there would be nothing to fear or lose. Despite my frail condition, I had a great sense of exhilaration. I lost consciousness shortly after the anesthesiologist began to give the general anesthetic. I regained consciousness and was transported to a hospital room. The first nurse who came to visit me appeared concerned and stated that she'd heard I had a rough time in the recovery area. I wasn't sure what she meant, but based on her statements and those of the doctors, it appears that I fell into shock or experienced a crisis during or after the operation. I was in excruciating pain as the general anesthesia wore off. The doctors refused to give me pain relievers, claiming that they might be harmful to my heart. The surgeon who did the surgery came to visit me the next day. He claimed he was astounded by what he observed during the operation and that my appendix had to have ruptured about 5 days prior. He didn't believe me when I told him I hadn't felt any discomfort until the attack, which prompted me to call the ambulance. He forewarned me about the potential issues during my rehabilitation and emphasized the necessity of my determination to heal. The days that followed were filled with pain and anguish, as well as hallucinations caused by the morphine and large antibiotic doses that I was given. The first difference I observed in myself was that I was no longer afraid of death. The risk of life-threatening consequences, as warned by the surgeon, did not bother me, and I was eager to follow his directions to improve my recovery. I appeared to be performing simple actions in novel ways, which I initially attributed to my condition and drugs. 1 week later, I was released from the hospital. I experienced a peculiar sense when I entered my flat, as if I were entering it for the first time, but also as if only a portion of me was entering. My convalescence was difficult because of my illness and the necessity to travel to the hospital every 2 days to have my wounds checked, as well as because my wife became depressed at the same time. Nonetheless, as the weeks passed, I became more at ease and began to see life with a joy that far exceeded anything I'd before experienced. I've believed in God since I was a child, though I was never a member of any religion and never frequently attended services. I was drawn to reading the Bible, and more specifically, the works of modern spirituality authors like as Deepak Chopra and Neil Walsh, roughly 2 months after my encounter. I felt compelled to read those novels, despite the fact that I'd never heard of the writers and had bought them nearly at random. The Bible appeared clearer to me than it had ever been. The novels called to me as though they were reminders of something I'd always known but had forgotten. I didn't relate my newfound interest in spiritual reading with my near-death experience at the time. I didn't even realize I'd had a near-death experience because I'd just read a few doubtful newspaper pieces about it. It wasn't until I read about near-death experiences in Conversations with God and other publications that I recognized they seemed to match my own. As I write this, on the 1-year anniversary of my near-death experience, I feel like a completely different person. My perspectives on spirituality and life purpose have shifted dramatically. I have a radically different perspective on the world and my fellow creatures. I no longer fear death and live in acceptance of the insight I received. Death is not the end of anything, and all of our true needs will be met. Whereas I used to notice many discrepancies in spirituality, the universe, and history, everything now appears to me very coherent. I can see now that my NDE started a process of change that has lasted a year and appears to be continuing.